This short film from the Bury St Edmunds Town Trust is designed to give you more information about our current project, the renovation of 11 High Baxter Street, Bury St Edmunds. The Trust bought this property in the spring 2019 with the intention of saving a unique building which has been abused and neglected over the years. Our aim is to renovate it in a sensitive manner which respects its history, which also makes it possible to find a viable use for it going forward. Only by doing this will we be able to save the house for the foreseeable future. Angel Hill and the Abbey were once the town centre and a short distance from the house. 11 High Baxter Street is a Grade 2 listed building in the town centre conservation area. It is located in one of the streets which make up part of the town known as the medieval grid. Streets like Hatter Street, Whiting Street and of course Abbeygate Street. This is the Norman layout of the town, which was created by Abbot Baldwin in the 12th century. The Abbey owned most of the properties within the grid at the time. The monks charged tariffs on every economic activity within the town, even including the collecting of horse droppings in the streets. By the mid-19th century, High Baxter Street had become little more than a service street for the commercial properties in the Butter Market to the west. Indeed, excepting only number 11, the entire east side of the street was demolished in the 1960s and has only recently seen the development of some residential properties. Since the mid-1990s, the house was let as separate rooms, a house in multiple occupation. Unfortunately, due to the fire and other regulations, this is a use which is not sympathetic to a historic building. Notwithstanding this, the building is basically sound, as the roof was finished or refurbished as part of the major works in the 1970s. As a result, the building has been kept reasonably wind and watertight, the main damage to the fabric being the result of leaking surfaces within the building. The current condition of 11 High Baxter Street makes a negative contribution to its historic environment. Not to put a too fine a point on it, it's been a bit of an eyesore for many years. From street evidence, it seems that this house was built by the late 15th century. High Baxter Street would have been occupied by people who were reasonably well off, probably tradespeople or craftspeople, since the property was ideally located adjacent to the market square, what Jane Austen referred to as middling folk. The occupiers were likely to also trade from their premises. The house was altered considerably in the late 16th and 17th centuries, when it was remodelled and an attic converted to accommodation. It is likely that the first floor was jettied, and this was removed at this time. It was further altered in the 18th and 19th centuries, so it was apparently still in reasonably affluent occupation then. The current street elevation has 2 stories with a steep machine-made clay tile roof containing attic accommodation, with 2 wooden framed dormers with pitched roofs, also finished in clay tiles. The roof at the ground floor level are brickwork of different ages. There is a brick plinth, which is probably dated 17th or early 18th century. This is generally of a Flemish bond brickwork to the north and off-centre door. There is evidence of a large opening at the south of the central door, and masonry infilling that opening is of mid-late 20th century and in flattened bricks. These match brickworks to the rear, which rather confirm that this was a period of the building's life which had a passageway through it. Originally, the ground floor would have been set back about 18 inches behind the current wall line, and the stucco finished first floor would have been cantilevered over the pavement. This arrangement seems to have been removed in the late 17th and 18th century. The street elevation is a hybrid of periods and detail, and while it tells a story, it isn't necessarily one with a happy conclusion. The building has been treated in a pragmatic rather than a sympathetic manner, and this is reflected in its appearance in the street. It's not just neglect, but also some crude and insensitive alterations, which have left the elevation looking as it does. The north elevation tells a much more of a story. Here again, the elevation is blind, but there's a huge chimney in the East Anglian style, attached with a broad base shaped into a narrow upper part, with a stucco render finished, topped with 17th century brickwork. At the base of the stack is a plinth stone, which seems to have been incorporated in the original construction, and may be a piece of salvage from the abbey post-Reformation. The south-facing elevation is blind and faced entirely in rough-cast stucco render, which is the building to which it has been attached for a large portion of its life, was demolished in the 1960s, must date to that period of demolition. There is a plain wooden barge board, which must also date from the 1960s, but the chimney stack of red brick is 17th century. To the east is a modern rendered brick boundary wall with brick coping. The rear extensions which survive are the result of 3 phases of work. The rudimentary conservatory structure seems probably to be part of the 1970s, and in between it and the main house and the kitchen extension is largely late 19th and 20th century, but retains a part of earlier closet-type structure, with some brickwork on its south wall being apparently 18th century. The rear east-facing brick elevation exhibits at ground floor to the south of the rear extension more of the 1970s flattened brickwork infill, which must have been formed part of the passageway. Here too is a large panel of 16th century brickwork. The brickwork is set upon a flint base, which is presumably the original foundation wall of the house, and it seems the brickwork may have been constructed during the 16th century and replaced the original wooden framed external wall, so the main building line seems to have always been where it survives now. Moving inside on the ground floor, has a pair of rooms to the south, more or less, central corridor, and a single room to the north, with a staircase to the east of this room, all within the footprint of the original building. The northern front room on the ground floor was created in the late 19th or early 20th century, when the east and south walls and a solid flat plaster on lathe ceiling was inserted. The former has a plasterboard finish now on top of the lathes, which remains behind. The 1970s work also resulted in the lining out of the north wall, which hid a remarkable confection of construction, including a 17th century fireplace of huge proportion, which has been flanked with moulded stone jambs, which appear to have been salvaged from the abbey after the Reformation. The fireplace was clearly too large for a later generation, and it was reduced, with a bressumer cut and left spanning into 2 smaller fireplaces, with brickwork presumably from the 19th century. Also to the west of this wall is the original post which defines the line of the original 15th century west wall, and adjacent to this are areas of surviving elements of the original north party wall with wattle and daub, behind which is a metal lathe reinforced plaster finish to the chimney stack, which would have been inserted when the neighbouring house was demolished in the 1960s. To the east of the construction is all of the late 19th and 20th centuries, when the staircase enclosure was created. The door is of the 1970s period. The other rooms on this floor were remodelled in the 1970s, when it seems concrete floors were put in and south and east walls were installed. The first floor construction above is of a handsome 15th century joists with softwood bordered infilling of a later date, spanning between the central north and south, a crossbeam, and the west wall. There are remnants of lime wash surviving on the carpentry. The floor is in remarkably sound condition and helps relate the changes to the location of the west external wall. The stair enclosure with a wooden bordered lining seems to have dated to a remodelling of the late 19th century, early 20th century. It is not clear why the stair was rebuilt at this time. The flight from the first to the second floor was installed earlier. Below the staircase is a small floor which gives access to a small cellar. The kitchen is mainly from the 1970s work and will form part of the area to be demolished and replaced with a new contemporary extension. This room gives further details of the makeup of the walls and the very fine 15th century ceiling. Moving on to the first floor, the planned form of this floor level was effectively created in the late 18th century, with the original footprint of the 15th century house. The latter is defined by the original frames which largely survive, with posts in 4 corners of the house, and approximately at the centre of the plan. The ties at the north and south external walls are missing and are presumably were removed when the chimneys were installed, on these elevations at the end of the 16th and 17th centuries. The east wall beam was curtailed at the staircase, and while the original post survives, another seems to have been inserted to the south to support the north and the barn. The external walls, all of original 15th century construction, although they are refinished both externally and internally. The corridors and landings in the area were greatly remodelled over the years, but seem to have had its earliest form in the 18th centuries. The walls to the west of 18th century seem to be a short area to the east. It seems likely that the corridor was extended to the south in the 1970s period of alterations. The stair flight to the second floor is basically of late 16th and early 17th century period, although very heavily rebuilt and with limited fabric remaining from the earliest period. On the staircase are 3 posts, that in the northeast corners seemingly original, and those in the east and north walls presumably installed at the time the staircase was installed. The second floor accommodation was created when the original attic was replaced and remodelled as part of the major changes effected in the late 16th and early 17th century. The current layout and finishes seem to be entirely from the 1970s. The earliest elements seem to be the northmost dormers, both of which predate the 1970s changes, but the window joinery all seems to be of much later date. The current attic space exhibits the roof structure which survives from the 16th and 17th century changes, but also significant alterations and reinforcements added to those earlier elements. The roof is fully lined with modern roof felting below the machine-made clay tile finish. In conclusion, it is important to understand the assessment of significance of this building. It has a core and a significant historical fabric and plan form dating from the late 15th century. This is of the highest significance. The building was changed significantly in the late 16th and early 17th century when the attic was converted and staircases and chimney stacks were added, and much of this fabric survives. This again is of very high significance. The late 18th and early 19th centuries, there was further remodelling on the first floor layout, and it still survives. This also is of significance. The film has examined the history and development of this fascinating historic building, and we could at this stage say a lot more, and we have tried to explain its significance. It has explained the sorry recent history of the building, the way that its significance has been hidden by changes, especially in the 20th century, but really from the 19th century, and how this has meant that while by good fortune it survived the clearances of the 1960s, it did so undervalued. That the Bury Town Trust bought the house and is determined to restore it for the benefit both of the building and the wider community has to be seen as a good thing. The building has not been commercially viable to a developer. It was only the Trust's charitable status that has meant it could bring forward the proposals and try and make the building both attractive to potential future owners and viable as possible. This autumn we see work start on the house, with repairs to the elevations and demolitions of the rear parts, followed next year by internal changes and a new extension. We will be trying to make this building as sustainable as possible. Considering the fabric, this gives us many challenges with regard to insulation, air tightness, non-fossil fuel heating systems, to mention a few. We hope you have enjoyed this short video, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year for a site visit when we will be making progress on our project. Thank you.